Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. We are so happy to have everyone here. Before we launch into a discussion of Meredith Talusan's new book, Fairest, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors and writers like Meredith and Jenna, we wouldn't be here today, and we so appreciate it. So tonight we are excited to have with us Meredith Talusan to launch her newest book, Fairest. Meredith is an award-winning author and journalist who is the founding executive editor of Them, Condé Nast LGBTQ+ digital platform, where she is now a contributing editor. She has contributed to other books, including the New York Times bestseller, Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay, Nasty Women, and Burn It Down. She frequently writes for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Wired, Condé Nast Traveler, and many other publications. Joining Meredith in conversation will be Jenna Wortham. Jenna is an award-winning staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. She's the co-host of the podcast Still Processing, which I thoroughly recommend as a quick aside, and co-editor of the forthcoming visual anthology Black Futures with Kimberly Drew, out in fall 2020 from One World. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Meredith and Jenna to Zoom.
Ta-da!
Hello.
Reveal.
That was a really dramatic reveal.
I know, right?
I felt.
This is so bad. This is going to be so bad, Jenna, because it just feels like we're on chat together.
Oh, but
it
we
doesn't
are.
It doesn't feel like a public event.
Don't worry, I'll keep you in line. Or not.
Okay.
I mean,
Oh, yes.
it's your
please.
book launch, babes, and you get to do whatever you want. So you can be as free and as naughty as you want to be.
Well, I like that. I like the idea of you keeping me in line. So
On it.
on it.
Well, Meredith, congratulations. I just feel like this book has been such a journey. And even when we started becoming friends a few years ago, this was in the mix. You were reading from it, you were working on it. And it's so exciting to see a thing that someone you really respect and care about just come out into the world and be such a terrific document and piece of writing. And, it's so hard to release or launch anything in a moment when there's so much else going on. And I want to say thank you for giving us a reason to celebrate you, because the work is so worthy and it's such an important thing to devote our attention and time to. And it just feels so good to be here with you and to be in service to you as your friend and in service to the work. So I'm happy
Thank
for you.
you so much. I really appreciate it. The fact that people are interested in the book at this moment in time, something that it's been a funny, because people have been asking me, like, how do you feel about launching this book? How do you feel about whatever, like, its chances of success or what have you? And I
Do that.
Huh?
Who asked you that like that?
A couple of interviewers.
Interesting. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
So yeah, and and the thing that I can honestly say is that there are there are many things that we need to worry about more than how my book does, right? I want, because I think maybe it's the former academic in me, I know that a book's initial reception isn't necessarily indicative of its life, right? Beyond the initial time that it's been released. And for me, it's much more important that it gets read consistently and that it has, a life outside of this moment. And so, yeah, but having said that, I deeply appreciate all of the support, and have just been, you were one of the people who I feel like I mean, part of the reason why I chose you and Alok as the people to do my launch with was because like you were two people who read the book and only had good things to say about it. And I took that to heart, I feel like, in a way that, you know, like I feel like throughout the process of, you know, like of editing and proofreading and revising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you know, like I feel like I can just sincerely say that, and I'm a Cancer, I'm sorry.
I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, my Cancer is a North Node, so one of my placements. So please let it out. Let it out.
So yeah, no, but I really mean it. You know, like I did really in my head was just like, well, you know, like Alok and Jenna love this book, and that's, you know, like that's really more than enough. I mean, for me, the attention and the appreciation of people I respect and love is in a lot of ways like more important to me than some abstract public, right? Yeah. So.
Oh, I wish I could hug you right now.
I know.
Through the
No, but that's the thing. But that's the thing is that if we were actually in a public space, you know, like you would see like academic Meredith. You would see like, you know, like sassy public Meredith more, and I don't know if that would have happened, but who knows. Oh, by the way, like while I have my glasses off, I am modeling. I don't know if people can see my there is the Fairest wand, which is this eyeliner collaboration that I did with Philippine.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so that's available now on the Fluid website if you're interested. Just because I wanted, you know, like Fluid was the company that kind of like was my gateway to getting back to makeup after you know, like a couple of years of like being kind of like not very I don't know, just sort of like really tired of having to like present myself in that way. And you know, like for people who don't know, Fluid is a gender non-conforming, you know, trans, like super trans, not just friendly, but like super trans identified brand. And it's really kind of like and they have like all of these like wild, crazy colors that are just like not what basically like they're not made for the cis gays, I think. You know, like this is my interpretation of the stuff that they make. And so that made me feel more comfortable just being like, oh, okay, like I'm putting this like cobalt blue lipstick on because I feel like it. And, you know, like some straight man is gonna think it's ugly, and that's better.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just an aside.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's so great. Well, it means a lot to be, you know, here with you. And it felt like such a privilege to be trusted with your early words. And I think one of the main reasons the work resonated with me so much is because you are an academic and you do have this tremendous grasp of language, but there's so much emotion in the book. You know, you really write towards this idea of like a very unflinching look at all the things that kind of get in our way and all the ways in which when we're our younger, less formed selves, you know, we might subscribe to white supremacy, or we might really try to see, you know, certain power structures as being the only proxy for power that are available to us, you know. And I think it's really hard to not only access those moments in life, but to write about them, and then also kind of write about them and the shame and the difficulty of that past self, and just kind of present it. Like you just sort of were like, this is how I was in this moment in time, which is something I really want to talk to you about, because it's a real marvel. Because I just don't know how one goes there and is not deeply apologetic. You're not over explanatory. Like there's this moment in your book, we'll just dive right in actually. But there's this moment in your book that stood out for me from the first time I read it, where you talk about, you know, your parents coming to the Harvard campus.
Mm.
And you've got your darker skinned parents and your light ass walking around, and you're like, I didn't explain anything to anybody. And I'm just like, Meredith, like, it's just, I remember, because of my own internal racism and internalized classism, and like, I also had moments of shame around my parents, but those are like so buried deep in the Jenna trove of Scorpion treasures that only my therapist gets access to. And I think one of the things I'm so curious about too is, I think so much for us, our work can be cathartic, and like we can transmute a lot of that pain by making something of it and making work of it. And I think, I think that's kind of where I want to start, which is to hear about, was that process like that for you? Or how did you get through some of those really difficult moments and excavate them?
I feel like by the time that I wrote the book, I was emotionally ready, right? So it wasn't the process of sort of that excavation process happened over drafts, because one of the things that I find is that the first time I render a story in scene, one of the things that I notice is that I tend to render it more according to my sort of like convenient, kind of like self-rationalizing versions of what happened, right? And I think, and then as I'm like working on a scene and revising it, I think to myself, okay, like how did that really happen that way? Like how did those interactions actually happen? And it's like, no, like actually I did not, like there was a draft in which I introduced my parents to people. And I realized as I was working on it, because it's just like all of this writing, right? Just like, no, like that part actually is not true. Like I did not introduce myself to people. I mean, I did not introduce my parents to people. The only people who found out that they were my parents were people who came up to them and was just like, oh, hi, like you're this person who is like attached to this other person who I know. And I think that was much more striking. There's a scene in the book in which I take my parents to this queer alumni dinner. And that was a lot more striking, in part because it was an occasion where there wasn't a lot of milling around and introducing people to each other. Like we were sitting at a dinner and they were clearly associated with me, but people were very confused why these two brown people were, like next to me, and somehow that I had brought them, right? Like, I think that was something that I really clearly remember as, like as a part of my experience, right? And me feeling like, oh, like I'm just gonna ignore the questions. Like I'm not like, people find it too awkward to ask the questions, and I'm just gonna let it be awkward, right? Because I can't, because I'm too like there's just so much there, like I'm ashamed of them, but they also take credit for my success in ways that I find really triggering. So they're very, they're a bunch of, and I think that's one of the things that I worked really hard to do in the book, was to really, really specify so many of those interactions, because one of the things about leading an intersectional life is that things can be fine on one intersection and not be fine on other intersections, right? Like my dad and I, it's really funny, like my dad and I are estranged. We're actually semi-estranged now. Like I actually saw him in a group context when I was in the Philippines, but we didn't talk. But people assume that it's translated, and it's not. It has nothing at all to do with me. He's actually like was super supportive of my various coming out processes, right? But we really clash in terms of like race and family dynamics, and you know, like the difficulties, one of the really hard things for, you know, especially I think a lot of Filipino fathers to deal with is the fact that they take their children to the States to become more successful. But then when they do become more successful, they still expect them to be subservient to the fathers, right? And those kinds of like first generation, I mean, I'm really 1.5 generation, but you know, like sort of like parent-child dynamics have been really difficult for us, especially because he wasn't a big part of my life when I was a child.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, you and I met, I don't know how many years ago it was.
2017, August 2017.
Oh my gosh, that summer of that year keeps coming up for me. I have to look into this.
We got lost hiking, and we had to scale a fence completely completely unnecessarily. Do you remember that? But then you taught me how to take selfies, so I had a good day.
Was it just me, you, and Mona? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it was just this.
So it was me, Meredith, and Mona Chalabi, who's an amazing data journalist. You should follow on Instagram and on Twitter and all the other parts of the web. But we were like, let's go for a hike, and everyone was just like, be careful. Like, like, we'll be back by dinner. And it's just like thick woods. There's no lights. Like it was just.
And then there's no GPS, right?
No
and then
GPS.
all of a sudden we're just like, we were dependent on GPS. And then all of a sudden there was no GPS. Yeah.
But then we found the road, and I was like, oh, it's golden hour. And I was like, well, now that we found a road, we're fine. And I was like, Meredith, come here. Like, let's just take these images because look at all this foliage.
I know.
That was so silly. That was so fun.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
What were you going to say? Go ahead.
Well, you know, but that memory, but that's kind of, it's funny because when I was reading your book, it reminded me of that time in JJLA in a way, because you shared, well, I was a child performer, I was a child TV star, and knowing you, and you're so natural in front of lots of people, and you have this grace, and you have incredible comedic timing, it made total sense to me. But then of course, reading the book, it gets into the sort of the grimmer details of what that actually meant for your family dynamics and what it meant for your relationship to your parents. But there's this part that I highlighted here that I really love, where you talk about one of the first moments of acting on stage, on TV, and seeing yourself on television with your parents. And you wrote, though their reactions fell away as I continued to watch, and I found myself mesmerized by the odd sensation of being someone else. And it's so fascinating to think about you as such a precocious child, like understanding even then the levels and tiers of performance, even before anything related to gender. And well, the racial stuff is starting to percolate through because your family's kind of constantly commenting on your skin tone. But yeah, I don't know. I just was really blown away by even then, just this awareness of the slippages that would continue to define your life, of stepping into these other identities and roles.
And yeah, and that's an experience that very few people have, right? Mm-hmm. That experience of watching yourself on TV and just sort of, and the other thing about that is that, I was completely obsessed with silver spoons when I was a kid because Ricky Schroeder was this like blonde American kid, and he was my only, people kept telling me, oh, like you're going to be American someday, because you're going to move to America and you're blonde and you're going to be American. And I kept just being like, what does that mean? I don't understand what that is.
Wow.
Wow. You keep telling me that, but I have no idea. I have no frame of reference for it. So, like watching Silver Spoons was my only entry point into having a kid who was like a few years older than me, but around my age. And I just basically copied his mannerisms, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that's still part of my vocabulary, because it's one of the things that, like I talk about this in the book, like there are albino Filipino people that you can tell are Filipino. in part because of their body language, right? Like I really internalized and mimicked this sitcom kid in order to, in order to act and move in ways that I thought were American. And then lo and behold, I was cast as a kid in a TV show in the Philippines. And so I ended up, like being, like, and essentially like the shots were the same. Like there were these, and I wouldn't be surprised if the director of the sitcom watched Silver Spoons. I mean, it was a super, super popular show. So I have this super, super clear memory of this close-up of, this close-up of Ricky Schroeder or like this close-up of me merging in my head with the image in my head of a close-up of Ricky Schroeder. And that was kind of like my entry point into feeling like I could be American, like that was a really, and it's weird to, it's just it's odd to think. And I've done that so much in my life until relatively recently, like there's this pendulum, right? So it was just like at a certain point, I was very much like, I did not question identifying with white people, right? Like I did not question having this sort of like internal image in my head of a white person whenever, like when, like another example in the book is when I ended up in a relationship with an heir to the baronetry at the time, but he's now properly a baronet. His name is Rafe Wedgwood. And one of the jokes among our friends is that, I was a gay man at the time, but that if we were to get married, if gay marriage were to become legal in England, I would be Lady Wedgwood, right? And at the mention of Lady Wedgwood, these images would flood through my head, right? Of Gwyneth Paltrow and Emma, like was definitely, and like all of these Jane Austen characters. And the really funny thing is that Rafe's family home is actually at the bottom of Box Hill where Emma is set. So there's this is actually like not, it's not completely, sort of like out of the blue. But the thing that I realize from that now is how really kind of pernicious that was, right? Like how only, like how very few people have the same kind of direct access to that imaginary, right? I mean, I don't know, like I guess I can't say that for sure. Like maybe there are a lot of brown people out there who deeply identify with white people, but now that but when I think about it now, I wonder to myself, like what would it have been like had I had more immigrant Filipino, immigrant Asian, was more aware of, like of models of being, of moving through the world that were not predicated on whiteness, right?
And I mean, that's also why I think your book is so important. I meant to say this at the beginning, but you can buy it online through Strand, which everybody should. But I think, there are so many narrative threads in your book, and you've had such a life, and you still continue to have such a life, that I just think are really important to read about and will continue to be really important to read about. I think there's so many threads there. Let me try to grab one. When we talk about, I'm curious to how it felt in your body to, allow people to see you as American and allow people to see you as white, and sort of, that plays on so much of white people's lack of imagination, right? Because they just can't imagine, I think, but we're so used to narratives around passing, dealing with people, very fair-skinned Black people,
Mm-hmm.
who then kind of disappear into white society, and then you never hear from them again. And so for me, it was just like this riveting, like, you know, mystery unfolding, just like, well, what is that world even like, you know? And I'm just so curious too, like, yeah, I mean, I'd love to know kind of more about how it felt to kind of feel that, I guess, crossing over in some ways, both into whiteness, and then also, you know, there's that part in the book where you talk about allowing people to kind of see you as American, and that feeling quite
right. And they are distinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a period of time when I had a pretty thick Filipino accent, and my English grammar wasn't perfect, and so people just thought I was a weird immigrant from somewhere, and like a lot of times they would think either Central Asia, or, you know, like the Asian part of Russia, or like somewhere in Scandinavia. Like those were the two major guesses, right? And I think that period, that liminal period, was definitely like super fascinating, because it felt very similar to that liminal period when I first started transitioning, right? Which is why it was so important for me for those two plots to be entwined, my gender transition and my, you know, coming into an American white identity. Is that because at the end of that process, you don't even really think about it most of the time, right? Like I sort of, I take for granted, because of all of the data that I've accumulated, I take for granted that white people typically perceive me as white, right? Because there are very, very few white people who have identified me as albino. And actually very, very few Asian people who've identified me as albino, but many, many Black people who've identified me as albino.
We know, we're like, what's going on here? And your friend in the book too, who's like, I see you. I'm forgetting, but
yes, my friend Kit. Yeah, and so, but I think during that liminal period is still a time when, you know, it's like the seams are still showing through, right? And so you still have those moments when it's just like, oh, like, is this person perceiving me in this particular way? Right? And what does that feel like in your body? The thing is that it feels like, over time, it feels unconscious and feels like something that you have to work really hard to, at least for me, like I have to work really hard to overcome, right? You know, to account for the fact that people generally perceive me as white, even though I am internally not, you know, because you're living through the world, you're doing your activities, you know, like I'm a very, you know, like I'm constantly thinking about 100 million things. And then it doesn't occur to you that, you know, like something that happens has like this racial component until later. I mean, even yesterday, my, you know, Josh, my husband, who is, I think, watching in the other room, he, you know, like he was so kind, like he made me lunch, as he often does. And I was on my phone, you know, like keeping track of whatever, like my mentions, et cetera, et cetera. And then, and he, you know, just sort of like raised his voice a little bit. And he said, "Get off the phone, Meredith." And then I was just like, but it's my publication day. And then like, you know, like the tears started forming. And then I was just like, you are doing this whole, You're engaging in the Karen continuum. This is what I call it, the Karen continuum.
Oh
Because
my
it
God.
really is not something that, like this person who is incredibly kind and patient has like made you food and just wants you to like pay attention for like 5 minutes, and you're gonna cry because you know that, well, not necessarily consciously, right? But but like you've been socially you positively reinforced that when you cry, people, like people empathize with you. Like that's something that I have been, that is like an ongoing work in progress. Especially because like tears seem to come easily for me, which was not the case before I transitioned. So
there it's so interesting because I think, I mean, again, I really think the book has so much to say about the ways in which, we're socialized and conditioned to think about race and to think about gender, and what, how we can divest from those set notions in order to be more expansive versions of ourselves. And there's a way in which you do really deconstruct white womanhood, even as you're kind of aspiring towards it, and finding yourself within those, very much within that realm. You are still kind of looking at it and kind of demystifying it too, which I think is important for white women to read, but it's interesting because you said something a moment ago that I wanted to return to, and it's when you were in England and this fantasy of Lady Wedgwood was coming up for you, in the relationship with Rafe, and you thought of like Gwyneth Paltrow and all these particular white cisgender women. But then you also talk about when you're starting your gender transition, you don't identify with any of like, Renee Richards, like any of the white trans models that are out there. Like that to me also is really like a fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a visual slippage, right? And there's this way in which I actually did, like I think basically what's really weird about being an albino Asian person who was assigned male is that people judge the physical properties of my body by a white standard. So, so in the Philippines, it's much more common for people to be aware that I'm trans because I am, like I'm tall. If once they identify me as Filipino, and Filipino who is not mixed race, then it becomes clear to people that, like I'm taller than a lot of, whatever it is, like all of, the physical. I'm not going to get into these types of minute physical details. And for me, the two things that stood out about, about figures like Renee Richards, were that, were that physically, yes, like they were not, they were distinct, they felt distinct from me in appearance, but also I come from a completely different gender constellation, right? Like they, especially at the time, like the party line was, like you're always a girl, you're always a woman, like you were, and it was very intuitive for me that it was just like, what does that even mean? Because being a girl in America is completely different than being a girl in the Philippines. So what does it, like, A, what does that even mean? But also B, what does that mean for me? Right? And it was always super clear to me that I was not always a girl, because in part because I liked significant aspects of being a boy, you know what I mean? And, like I was a girlish boy, but I still, like I enjoyed being a boy in the Philippines. I did not enjoy being a boy or a young man as much, nearly as much in the States, right? And I think because of that comparative cultural perspective, it was very hard for me to identify with the with that notion that like you have to sort of like turn away from your past, because it would have also meant turning away from my Filipino childhood, right? Like that for an intersectional minority, you're not just, like you're not just like taking away like one part or like one thread of your story, like you're also taking away everything else, right? Like and by that point, there in college, I fantasized about, like having grown up in the States. But I think by the time that I was in my mid-20s, without as much of that pressure to belong as one feels in college, and because of the fact that I returned to the Philippines in 2000, which was a really important trip for me and really reconnected me with my childhood and my grandmother, it was really the idea that somehow I could never, that I needed to revise that version of myself. I couldn't attach myself to that. And I caught a lot of flack in the trans community at the time because of that position. And, so that was like, 18 years ago. So if I'm prepared to talk about this openly now, it's because there's been a gestation of 18 years. Like I literally, when I was in early transition and people perceived me as passing, and, I said on the chat, because I went on group chats for trans people that I was planning to be out, people actually accused me of actually being a cis woman who was trolling them.
Oh, wow.
Because the party line was so strong at that point that if you're passing, you just, like disappear into presumed cis womanhood.
Wow.
By the way, I'm just gonna say your skin is glowing and it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well,
that's more of a Jenna chat comment.
Well, we haven't seen each other in a little while, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. I'm trying to drink a lot of water. I also stopped wearing makeup. I only wear makeup for these types of things, and I think that my skin is just like that was the problem. The virus was already in us. So anyway, we're the virus. But okay, so I want to make. Thank you, Fran. So. Okay, yes. In a few moments, we're going to do audience Q&A. So if you guys have questions, if any of you folks have questions, please put them in the chats. There's a Q&A button in the Zoom, I'm told, and they will be filtered to us so we can answer all of your burning questions. But before we get to that, I think I'm really interested too in, wow, that's so interesting. You've really had a lot of time to kind of work out some of these things in public, and that's the gift of being a writer who has worked in public for so long too, that you've had Meredith is like, I've been canceled, like cancel culture, like I've already been there.
Yep.
And that's incredible to think about. I'm curious too, when you first started to reclaim back your non-white identity, and when you started to really own being Filipinx or Filipino, Filipina, what did that feel like, and how was that process for you? And how did people respond as well?
I think there've been a number of different phases of that, but certainly the one that has been most consequential for me is just the fact that when there was a period of time, about 7 years, from around like 2008 to around 2015, in which I actually was more private about being trans. People I was close to knew, but I ended up in a lot of situations where I felt like I was being made either into like the poster child of transness, or like like it just became too much. So when I went to grad school at Cornell, I just decided I'm just not going to talk about it publicly. And I think, but what happened was, I think, as soon as the thing that I didn't really understand about that is that as soon as I made that decision, it then meant that I couldn't be proximate to trans people in the same way, right? Or, that wasn't voluntary, but that was just like one of the effects. And I think that once I started talking about and writing on trans issues online, it became really clear that the most pressing trans issues are issues that affect trans people of color, trans women of color, Black trans women specifically. And as soon as I became interested in telling other people's stories, those were the stories that I felt like were most important to tell. And that was when I began to form relationships with trans people of color and trans women of color, Filipinx, trans women, trans non-binary, trans people, all of these different trans people from all of these different backgrounds. And I feel like that was when the sort of like abstraction, that was when I realized that I was in principle aware of my identity and proud to be, Filipino and a first generation immigrant, et cetera, et cetera. But I was not living that existence. And to a large extent, I'm, like that's still very much a work in progress, right? To a large extent, it still is in a lot of ways like really, really difficult. It creates, there's just like a lot of tension points around both my racial and my trans identity, because it's hard to classify me in both ways. So one of the things that happens is that, obviously I have privileges that a lot of trans people don't. And it's very hard to figure out first of all, like all of this is birth lottery anyway. So nobody deserves anything, like at a base level. But then there's also the question of like, to what degree is me being white passing and cis passing, to what degree has that advantaged me and disadvantaged other people around me, right? And that's always an open question, like whenever I'm around other trans people of color. And one of the things, and one of the effects of the deep racism and white supremacy in America is that it separates me from people who are, people who properly are my community members, right? And that's really hard psychologically. And yet at the same time, there's no question that I socially and materially benefit from it. But I think that definitely this period of time of, like writing about trans issues, reporting on, on violence in the trans community, especially among Black trans women and trans women of color, at a time when, like there were zero trans people who were doing it and zero, especially trans people of color. If I were to be offered that type of reporting now, I would definitely, try to advocate for a Black trans woman doing that reporting. So I think it's through those experiences that have allowed me to really see the ways in which I benefit from, from white and cis passing privilege, and that it's pretty much like, it's going to be like a lifelong struggle to figure out how to navigate out of it, right? To be able to muster my resources in a way that allows for a more just society, while at the same time acknowledging that I'm just an individual.
Mm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, thank you for that thorough answer. That was so, I'm like, this is recorded so I can watch this later. Okay, good. But I don't know. I really do want to commend you though for working out so much of that in public and in this book and in future books, because I think there often is this idea that one has to be so fully formed to express opinions or express ideas online. And that's just not how we work. That's not how people work. That's not realistic or even kind. We are all works in progress, and we all show up every day trying to do better than the last day. And I think thinking through those growth moments, and we always take on more work as those with I feel like the more interstices you have in your identity, like the more work you end up doing. And I don't know. I just appreciate how much you kind of lay it out and allow people to see what you worked through as you continue to work through it. So do you want to take some questions, or was there anything else you wanted to say?
I do want to take some questions.
Okay.
If you wouldn't mind reading their names, that would be really
happily.
Cool. And also, I'm going to get the chat transcript after this call. So if you're concerned that your question is not going to be answered, I will see them and I will answer them on Twitter.
So generous.
At least the ones that I can answer.
So this question's from Facebook, and it just says Facebook question, so I don't know who asked this, but thank you, whoever it was. The question is, was there anything you had to cut from the book that you wish you hadn't? Ooh.
Whew. Oh. That's a different question. So the book is, first of all, when I submitted the book to my editor, it was 107,000 words. And we were supposed to cut it down to 95,000 words, something like that. She sent it back to me and she said, I can't figure out how to cut without unraveling the structure of the book. Something like that. So I ended up with like 105,000 words as a draft. And as soon as I got the draft and it was approved by my editor, I went into this like really, really weird, just sort of like fugue state. Where I was just like, these words are approved, like somebody in a position of power has said that I can publish these words. I must make sure that everything in this book belongs in this book. And so I spent like a frantic week just being like, does this belong in the book? Nope. Does this belong in the book? Nope. So basically there are a bunch of parts of the book that are not, there are a bunch of scenes in the book that are not in the book just because they don't serve the work structurally, even though I love them. There's a scene, for instance, in which I dress in full Renaissance drag to do a presentation in Orlando for a Harvard seminar. And the professor was so impressed that he exempted me from the midterm paper. And drag, exempting you from schoolwork. But I think the biggest thing is I actually wrote an entire, I think it was almost 100 words, maybe like 80 to 90 word section. The book right now, the finished copy skips, right, from when I leave the Philippines to when I start Harvard. I actually wrote through that section. I wrote an entire section about high school. And then one of the things that I realized reading through the manuscript is that so many of the things that I dealt with in high school were things that I also dealt with at Harvard. So it just ended up feeling, repetitive to then go to Harvard and deal with, like different but very similar types of cultural adjustments. And we, alas, live in a world where it's more important to keep the Harvard section than the high school in poor Chino, California section. Although I do think that ultimately the Harvard Chino to Harvard was a bigger cultural shift and, like cultural shock for me than Philippines to Chino. Except for the fact that like people were making out in the halls when I went to high school, and I came from a religious public school. So basically spent the entire first year hiding under my desk because like I had no idea. But obviously I quickly adjusted because I was doing naked performance pieces by the time that I was, a senior in college.
Which is like my favorite thing in the book. Yeah.
I'm glad to know that.
Okay, here's another question from Facebook, and I'm just going to read them back to back. They're 2 questions, maybe from the same person, but thank you to whomever submitted these. Where do you think reporting on trans issues needs to go in the future? And then also, are there other trans journalists you would recommend reading?
Where should reporting on trans issues go? Let me do the first question because I feel like the first question is easier.
Okay.
Trans reporters, Heron Walker is really fantastic. Diana Turgi, who've both been laid off from Vice recently. Raquel Willis is really, really amazing. She was the executive editor of Out. I would love to see her, kind of like do a big investigative project. I'm trying to think. Those are some of the people that come to the top of my mind. I'm sure there are others. Serena Sonoma is really fantastic. Caitlin Burns, who works for Vox. I think in terms of where trans reporting should go next, I mean, I feel like the trans reporting should go to places where, like there's the continued reporting around violence because it's an ongoing issue. And we will continue, we have to continue to find ways to express the difficulties of those issues. But I also think on the other side of that, there needs to be reporting about trans people in which their transness is adjacent to all of their other identities. I feel like there really isn't enough of that. So what happens is like there's so many stories where like the person's trans experience is focalized at the expense of a bunch of their other experiences. And I feel like we can't live in a society where trans people are, are just a part of, are just like one of the things you can be without having stories in which that is the case, right? And it was actually like really funny because when they published the NPR, weekend edition piece, or the written part, the headline was Meredith talks about her new memoir, and her difficult relationship with her family. And I was just like, wow, like a headline about what I talked about, right? Like they actually did not write that I was trans in the headline. And I was enormously and really, really pleasantly surprised. And I thought that was really wonderful. And I think there needs to be more of that type of reporting, right? So those are my off-the-cuff responses.
Those are great. Here's one as well, also from Facebook. Don't know who submitted it, but thank you for your question. Living at so many intersections, have you ever seen yourself in a book or a film? And if so, which one?
I mean, I see parts of myself in different books and films, but I am going to demonstrate my nerddom right now. That the person that I have most really identified with is Data from the Star Trek The Next Generation series. just because he's
that.
so, you know, like he just really, really wants to be human. And he just doesn't have like complete access to that experience. And there are definitely, I mean, I feel like less so now. I feel like I inhabit my selfhood now in a more comfortable way, and I appreciate, you know, like the fact that I'm just not a person who is like other people. But there was definitely like a long period of time when I was just, when I felt like, oh, you know, like I'm like a robot, or like I'm like this person who is fundamentally different from everybody around me, because of the just like the dizzying number of both the intersections of my identity, but also the ways in which I pass as the converse of those intersections, right? You know, so it's like I'm albino, but I pass as able-bodied. I am, you know, like I'm Filipino, but I pass as white. I am a first-generation immigrant, but I pass as native-born. I am, you know, like I've come from really significant periods of poverty, but I pass, because of my Harvardness, I pass as somebody who is middle or upper class. And so that's, you know, like that's something that I'm super, super aware is an experience that, you know, that it's not even that, you know, like everybody's experience is unique, but it's just like there's no compass, right? I once tried to calculate statistically the chance that there's another person like me, and ended up concluding that there's like a greater chance of me not existing than me existing.
Wow.
And then I sort of stopped at that point and said, this is too depressing, you know. There's actually like less than 1 in whatever, like 7 billion chance that I should actually exist.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Um,
oh my gosh. Okay, I'm just checking to see if there are any more questions.
Okay.
Okay. Here's a Zoom question from Rob Goody. What challenges did the writing process present in telling your story, and was it easy or difficult to find your written voice?
The biggest challenge, I think, is because of the fact that I'm Filipino and I come from a society that automatically thinks about the collective before I think about the self. The biggest challenge was the feeling of responsibility to other people, which is actually why I wrote like most of the book in Guatemala, where I knew nobody. You know, I had no prior connection there, because I had to be like that far away to be able to tune out all of the other people who would be affected by the book. So that was, you know, so that was a really big challenge. In terms of developing my voice, I feel like that happened in, you know, like in the process of doing the work. And I switched to, you know, like maybe about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I switched to writing by hand. And that has made a really, really enormous difference. I think because of the fact that I'm able to ruminate about the structures of my words and the structures of my sentences without the distraction of the internet, you know, because I feel like whenever I'm typing on any device, like the internet is just looming. And I feel like there was just a moment, I remember this, you know, like I was in Guatemala, there was just this moment when I felt like, oh, like this prose right now, you know, like the combination of just sort of like the analysis and the description, as well as, you know, the sort of like really, really specific, you know, just sort of like nuanced emotional beats of the prose something that I had seen before, right? And that was the point when, you know, when I was sort of like, oh, like this is, you know, like this is different. I'm really excited about this. And I feel like then I became like there was just a point when I became really, really obsessed with the book in a way that for myself, like not any, you know, like for no other reason than the fact that like, I found it so fascinating that what was coming out was something that I wanted to, you know, that I wanted to read regardless of who wrote it, right? Which is not something that I feel a lot of the time or that I have felt about previous work, right?
Well, there's one more quick question, and it's
Okay.
so appropriate that this is the last question, but it comes from Alana Masad. Thank you very much for this question. And it says, what are you working on next?
Oh, Ilana, we have the same book birthday.
Oh, how sweet.
I am working on a novel. It's about a third drafted. I drafted the first section. It has a number of steamy scenes between women,
Yes.
which I'm super
Yes.
excited about, having written a book with mainly gay male sex scenes, not just mainly, exclusively, I guess. Or, well, I don't know. Well, anyway. But so I'm working on that. And then I'm also just, one of the things that I'm realizing is that I'm one of the few people who've worked consistently writing about trans issues since 2014. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of really important to, you know, for that, you know, because this has been a really pivotal time. So the kind of like the project after the novel project, I'm envisioning as some sort of translated essay collection, just to track the sort of like progress of the way that I thought about these issues as society was like trying to figure them out over this period of time from 2014 until, you know, like whenever it is I work on the book. So those are the two things that I'm working on, and it's just this really funny thing because I'm just not the type of person. I think it's partly my academic background where it's very abstract to me, like the idea of the success of a book. What's concrete to me is like my ability to publish my next book. So, you know, so for me, it's like the fact that, you know, the fact that people have been so supportive and the fact that, you know, so many people in my life have been such huge supporters and, you know, have boosted the book in all of these ways, has made that more and more possible. And that's something that I, you know, enormously appreciate because it's starting to look like this is actually going to work, that I'll be able to have a sustainable career as a writer. And that's a huge gift, you know, and I have, you know, everybody collectively to thank for that, but, you know, also specifically you.
And mostly yourself, but you love to see it and you deserve it, and it's exciting, and you have such a brilliant mind, so it's just exciting to, you know, see it in all the variations, whether it's in an article, in novel, a nonfiction memoir. I mean, there's just so much. So lucky us.
Your girl is flexible. That is one of the things. Speaking of truth or dare.
So after the book talk, meet us in the Zoom Demon Hour, where we'll be just a little bit of white wine. The after party. And we'll just see how it goes.
Oh, Jenna.
Well, thank you so much, and also a heartfelt thanks to everyone at Strand and Sabir and Andrea and Viking and all the people behind the scenes whose names we don't know, who are making sure all the tech stuff is working. It's just so seamless. And that does not go without lots of hands in the mix. So thanks to everyone for making this go so beautifully.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you both for a marvelous conversation. Like I thoroughly enjoyed it. I strongly recommend buying Fairest. Like I'm going to drop the link again in the chat, but if you don't want to buy it from Strand, still just buy this book. It's incredible. At so many points.
But buy it from Strand.
Yeah, buy it from Strand.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming and have a great night, and thank you.
Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you all for tuning
the chat
in.
transcript so I can say hi to people.
Oh.